The desert was quiet, the kind of quiet that came only after the sun bled out over the horizon. The dying light turned the sky into a bruised canvas of purple and gold, stretching endlessly across the empty plains. The wind whispered across the scrub grass, carrying the faint smell of smoke, dust, and something older, something like memory. There was no sound of laughter, no music, no cattle lowing in the distance, only the creak of the old windmill and the faint rattle of a loose shutter on the ranch house. That land had once been called Dry Creek, though no one had seen a drop of water there for 3 long seasons. The soil was cracked like the hide of an old mule, the fences leaning like weary men who had forgotten what they were standing guard for. Once the ranch had been alive, full of voices, the clang of tools, the scent of coffee in the morning air. That was before the drought, before the fever that took half the herd, before the earth turned mean and silent, and before Ethan McCall buried his wife behind the cottonwood tree at the edge of the property. Ethan was a man shaped by the land, broad shoulders, weathered skin, and eyes that had stared too long into distance and loss. He'd been alone for 2 years now, save for 3 ranch hands who worked when they could and drifted when the money ran out. His life had shrunk to a rhythm of necessity. Wake, work, watch the sky, pray for rain. He didn't speak much. Didn't need to. Words didn't change the fact that the West took more than it gave, and that everything you loved eventually turned to dust if you stayed long enough to watch it. That evening, as the last streaks of light faded from the mesa, Ethan stood by the corral, tightening the rope around a broken post. Sweat clung to his shirt, mixing with the dust until it formed a dull crust on his neck. The sky above him glowed faintly with the promise of stars, and the air had that strange stillness that came before something new, or something dangerous. The riders from the canyon. The first sign of them was a sound, faint hoofbeats echoing through the canyon, carried on the wind like the pulse of a distant drum. Ethan straightened, one hand resting on the handle of his revolver. Travelers rarely came this far out unless they were lost, desperate, or running from something. From the ridge beyond the dry creek bed, 2 riders appeared. They came slowly, horses lathered with dust, their silhouettes sharp against the dying light. As they drew closer, Ethan saw they were women, Apache women. Sisters, by the look of them. Both carried the same proud stillness in their faces. Though one was older, her expression tempered by caution and experience, while the younger's eyes burned like wildfire beneath the shadow of her braid. They stopped a few yards from the gate. The older one dismounted first, moving with the quiet grace of a deer, deliberate, unhurried, dangerous if provoked. "We seek shelter," she said in English, her voice low and steady, as if she had already accepted whatever answer might come. Ethan looked from her to the younger one, who still sat atop her horse, chin tilted high, eyes hard and defiant. He noticed the scars on her hands, the rawness of travel, the faint tremor in her horse's flanks. They'd been riding hard and far. "There's an empty bunkhouse," he said after a long silence. "You can stay the night. Water pumps behind the corral. There's stew inside." The younger sister's jaw tightened. "You offer kindness to those you don't trust?" He met her gaze evenly. "I offer shelter to those who need it. Trust comes after." For a long moment no one moved. The tension hung like a thread stretched thin in the air. Then the older sister, Tala, nodded once. "You have our thanks," she said, and dismounted. The younger Naya hesitated before following, her eyes never leaving Ethan's face. He turned away first, but he could still feel her stare, sharp as a blade, steady as a challenge. The long night begins by the time darkness fell. The ranch was wrapped in the soft hum of nighttime sounds, the croak of frogs in the dry creek bed, the occasional coyote cry from the hills. The sisters had taken shelter in the bunkhouse, where the lantern light flickered through the cracks in the shutters. Ethan sat on the porch, his boots crossed, the rifle resting against the wall beside him. He told himself he wasn't keeping watch, but the truth was, he didn't sleep easy with strangers under his roof. His thoughts drifted to his wife, Sarah, and the way she used to hum when she cooked by the stove. The sound of her voice had once filled every corner of the house. Now silence ruled it. He wondered what she'd think if she saw him now, sharing his home with 2 Apache women in the middle of a drought. The old world she'd believed in was gone. The frontier had no room for softness anymore. A coyote called again, closer this time. Ethan stood, stretched his back, and blew out the lantern. He walked to his room, the wood creaking under his boots. Outside the wind picked up, long, low, restless. It sounded like the land itself whispering secrets. He lay down on his cot but didn't sleep. Instead, he listened. Listened to the night breathe, to the horses shifting restlessly in the barn, to the faint murmur of voices from the bunkhouse. After a while, curiosity got the better of him. He rolled to his side, eyes open in the dark, and decided to test them. He wanted to know who they really were. So the rancher closed his eyes, slowed his breathing, and pretended to sleep. The whispers in the dark some time later. The door creaked, softly, careful. A faint brush of footsteps on the wooden floor. His hand twitched toward the rifle, but he kept still. Voices, 2 of them. The sisters. He could tell by their tones. The older one calm, cautious, the younger one burning with suspicion. "He sleeps," Naya whispered. Her voice trembled slightly. "We can take what we need. Food, horses. Before dawn," Tala answered, her tone a quiet warning. "He offered help. You would betray that?" "Help from a rancher means debt," Naya hissed. "You know what his kind do when they think we owe them." Silence followed. Then Tala again, softer, almost sad. "Not this one." I saw his eyes. "They carry pain. Pain makes men cruel," Naya whispered. "Cruel men make widows." The word struck Ethan like a knife. He wanted to move, to speak, to tell her she was wrong. But he couldn't. He stayed still, frozen, as their voices faded again. The last thing he heard was Naya's whisper, cold and certain. "We leave before first light. If he follows, he'll die on the trail." Ethan's breath caught. The night closed in around him, heavy and alive. He lay motionless, the echo of her voice tangled with the sound of the wind. He wasn't afraid. Not in the way a man fears death. No, what gripped him now was something far deeper, something that felt like destiny tightening its grip. He opened his eyes slowly. The moonlight pooled across the floorboards, pale and silver. The bunkhouse lantern still burned faintly outside. And somewhere between the silence and the coming dawn, Ethan McCall understood that his life, the long, lonely, broken life he had built from ashes, was about to change forever. Morning came slowly, drawn out and fragile like the first cautious breath after a long night of fear. The light slid across the floorboards of Ethan's room, cutting through the thin cracks in the shutters, touching the old rifle by the bed and the dusty boots that waited by the door. Outside, the world was still. The air was cool but already carried that faint, dry heat that promised another hard day. Ethan sat up, rubbed the stiffness from his neck, and listened. He half expected the sound of hooves fading into the horizon. The sisters gone before dawn, just as he had heard whispered in the dark. But when he looked out the window, the horses were still in the corral, their flanks glinting in the early sun. Smoke rose from the fire pit by the bunkhouse. They hadn't left. For a long moment he sat there, silent, staring. He didn't know whether to feel relief or confusion, or something deeper, something he couldn't name. Whatever had kept them there, it wasn't gratitude. It was something heavier. Breakfast and uneasy silence. When he stepped outside, the air smelled faintly of wood smoke and coffee. He walked toward the bunkhouse, boots crunching on the gravel, and found the sisters crouched by the fire. Tala stirred a small pot of beans with a carved wooden spoon. Naya sat beside her, sharpening a knife on a flat river stone, the rhythmic scrape filling the space between them. Both looked up when he approached. "Morning," Ethan said. Tala nodded, quiet and polite. Naya didn't answer. Her eyes met his for only a moment before drifting back to the blade in her hands. He knelt beside the fire, close enough to feel the heat on his palms. "You stayed." Tala stirred the pot once more. "We spoke of it. The horses were too tired to ride through the night. We will go when the sun is lower. You can rest here longer if you need," he said. "There's no rush." Naya's mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "You offer again without knowing us." "Why?" Ethan met her gaze. "Maybe I'm tired of seeing people disappear." She studied him for a moment, really studied him, as if searching for the trick in his words. But there was no trick, only the quiet sincerity of a man who had already lost more than he could bear. She said nothing. The three of them ate in silence. The wind swept through the yard, stirring the dust and rattling the loose boards of the barn. In the distance, the mesas shimmered beneath the rising heat. It was a land of beauty and cruelty in equal measure, a land that tested every soul who dared to stay. What lies between silence later that day? Tala helped patch one of the water barrels while Naya tended to their horses. Ethan busied himself with chores that didn't need doing, stacking hay that had already been stacked, checking the fence line twice. He couldn't shake the echo of the sisters' whispered words from the night before. He told himself it didn't matter. They'd leave soon. They'd take what they wanted and the West would keep on turning. But the more he watched them, the less certain he felt. There was a purpose behind their quiet movements, a shadow that followed them wherever they went. Near sunset, he found Tala by the corral, mending a strap with a strip of leather. She looked up as he approached. Her expression was softer now, touched with exhaustion. "You travel far?" he asked. "From the San Carlos reservation?" She said simply. "Too far for comfort. That's a long way to ride," he said. "What brings you through Dry Creek?" She paused, fingers stilling on the leather. Her eyes flickered toward the horizon. "Someone we must find. A man. A brother," she said. "And a debt." He waited, but she said no more. Ethan nodded, letting the silence stretch. He had learned long ago that the West was a place of half-told stories, secrets buried under the dust, truths too dangerous to speak aloud. He didn't press her, but inside, his curiosity stirred like a restless horse behind a closed gate. The rider from the canyon as the last light faded from the sky. The sound of distant hooves rose again, faint at first, then stronger, faster. Ethan's head snapped toward the canyon road. A single rider was cutting across the valley, a dark shape against the fire of the setting sun. Naya appeared from the barn, her knife already in her hand. "You expecting someone?" Ethan shook his head. "No," the rider drew closer. Even from a distance, Ethan could see the dust-caked coat, the glint of a rifle strapped to the saddle. Whoever he was coming fast and hard, the kind of man who didn't ride without reason. Tala's hand went to her waist, where a small pouch hung from a leather cord. Naya's jaw tightened and her eyes flashed with something between fear and fury. Ethan noticed and understood too late that this rider wasn't a stranger to them. The man reined in hard at the gate. His horse snorted, kicking up a cloud of dust. He dismounted in one smooth motion and looked straight at the sisters. "You should have kept riding," he said. His voice was rough, heavy with venom and familiarity. Naya's hand tightened around the knife. "We were done with you, Mason." Ethan's stomach turned. The name struck something familiar. He remembered hearing it before. A rancher down near Prescott known for taking land that wasn't his and breaking anyone who got in his way. Mason laughed, low and cruel. "Done, not hardly. You think you can run off with what's mine and hide behind this fool?" He jerked his chin toward Ethan. Before Ethan could speak, Naya stepped forward, fire in her eyes. "What you took from us wasn't yours to keep." The air turned electric. The sun dipped below the mesa, leaving them in a wash of gold and shadow. Ethan could feel the weight of every heartbeat, the smell of horse sweat and fear thick in the air. Mason's hand twitched near his holster. "Don't make me teach you the lesson again, girl." Ethan stepped between them. "You'll leave them be." Mason's eyes narrowed. "Stay out of this, McCall. Ain't your fight." Ethan's voice was calm, low. "You rode onto my land. That makes it my fight." A long silence followed, a silence so sharp it hurt. The West itself seemed to hold its breath. Then with a slow grin, Mason spat in the dust and turned toward his horse. "You'll regret this, rancher," he said, mounting up. "They always bring death where they go." He rode off into the canyon, the sound of his hooves echoing like thunder long after he was gone. Ethan stood there, watching the dust settle, his pulse pounding in his ears. He turned to the sisters, but they said nothing. Tayla's eyes glistened in the fading light, and Naya's hands trembled, not from fear, but from the effort it took to hold herself together. The wind rose again, sharp and cold, as if the land itself knew that trouble had found its way to Dry Creek Ranch. And deep inside, Ethan understood that whatever story these women carried, it was far from over. Night came heavy over Dry Creek, thick and starless, the kind of darkness that felt alive. The sky had swallowed the last of the sun, and the air shimmered with heat rising off the ground. Far out across the mesa, a single coyote cried, its lonely wail drifting across the canyon like a lament for something long dead. Ethan sat by the dying fire outside the bunkhouse, the orange glow painting the edges of his face in shadow. The whiskey bottle by his boot was half empty, untouched since he'd poured the first drink. He wasn't drinking to forget, not this time. He was drinking to remember, to keep his thoughts from spinning too fast, to steady the rising storm inside him. Across from him, the sisters sat close to the flames. Tayla had wrapped a blanket around her shoulders, her face turned toward the firelight, calm and watchful. Beside her, Naya stared into the embers, jaw tight, hands clasped as if holding back something she couldn't let go. The silence between them had weight. It wasn't the kind of silence that demanded words. It was the kind that carried truth too raw to speak. The mark of the past, finally, Ethan broke it. "That man," he said quietly, voice rough as gravel. "Mason, he's no stranger to trouble." Naya didn't look up. "He's worse than trouble." Tala spoke first, slow and deliberate. "He was the man who took our brother." The words hit the air like a shot. Ethan felt them in his chest, a chill that cut through the warmth of the fire. "Took him?" he asked. Tala's eyes reflected the flames. 3 years ago, after the raid on the San Carlos line, our brother Coda was captured when he tried to stop Mason's men from burning the camps. They said he was wanted for stealing horses, but it was Mason who stole them. Mason used him as a scapegoat, and he's still alive? Ethan asked, though he wasn't sure if he wanted to know the answer. Naya's gaze lifted then, sharp and full of fire. "He's alive. Mason sold him to the miners south of Prescott. He's a prisoner in all but name. We've been following his trail for weeks." Her voice cracked on the last word, just slightly, enough for Ethan to see the exhaustion behind her strength. Tala reached over, resting a hand on her sister's arm. "We will find him," she said softly, "and we will bring him home." Ethan watched the sisters in silence. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of sage and dust. He thought of the graves along the ridge, of the way the land buried both men and memory without distinction. He thought of the loss that hollowed him out after Sarah's death, the endless ache that never dulled. Now sitting here with these women, he recognized that same ache in them, just shaped differently. Their grief wasn't quiet like his. It burned wild and alive, driving them forward. "You shouldn't ride after him alone," Ethan said finally. "Mason's got men. Good ones, and worse." Naya looked at him with defiance. "We don't need saving." "Didn't say you did," he replied, eyes steady on hers. "But out here, survival's not about pride. It's about numbers and timing and knowing when to wait." She stood abruptly, firelight flashing across her face. Waiting is what men like him count on. For a long moment, they stood like that, two forces colliding in the space between them. One built from caution and loss, the other from fire and defiance. Tala's quiet voice broke the tension. "Naya," she murmured. "Sit." Naya hesitated, then slowly lowered herself back to the ground. The crackle of the fire filled the silence that followed. The story of the ring after a while. Ethan reached into his coat pocket. From it he drew a small silver band. Dull from years of wear, the metal scratched and bent. He turned it over in his palm before placing it on the ground beside the firelight. "My wife wore that," he said, his voice low, almost lost to the wind. "She used to say the West was a place where God tested people. I stopped believing that after she died." Tala's eyes softened. "How did she die?" "Fever," Ethan said simply. "Hit one winter night. I couldn't ride fast enough to fetch the doctor. I buried her myself." He paused, swallowing hard. "Since then, this place has been nothing but dirt and ghosts." The sisters were silent for a long while. The flames danced between them, crackling, spitting sparks into the night sky. Then Tala said softly, "The land remembers everything. The sorrow, the blood, the love. It never forgets. But it gives back too, and if you listen." Ethan met her gaze. There was something ancient in it, a strength carved from pain, the kind of resilience that didn't ask for understanding. Naya, who had said nothing, finally whispered, "Our brother wore a ring once. Like that, it belonged to our father. He said it was a promise, that no matter how far the land scattered us, we'd find our way back." She looked into the flames again, eyes glistening in the light. "We haven't." For the first time since he'd met her, Ethan saw something beyond the fire in her, a sorrow buried so deep it had hardened into anger. The approaching storm, the night stretched on. The fire burned low, then flared again when Tala fed it a handful of dry wood. Above them, clouds gathered slowly across the stars. Somewhere far off, thunder rumbled, a warning of rain or ruin. Ethan stood, stretching, and looked toward the canyon. In the faint light, he could still see the trail where Mason had disappeared hours earlier. Something told him the man wasn't done, not by a long shot. "He'll be back," Ethan said quietly. Tala nodded. "We know." "And when he comes," Naya added, voice like steel, "we'll be ready." Ethan looked at her, and this fierce, defiant woman with eyes like lightning and hands that trembled only when no one was watching, and something shifted in him. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was the spark of recognition between two souls who had both walked through fire and come out scarred. The wind picked up again, sharp and restless, blowing sparks into the darkness. Ethan tossed another log onto the fire and sat down once more, watching the flames rise. The West was a cruel teacher. It took from the weak, punished the foolish, and spared only those who could bend without breaking. He wondered, staring into that shifting firelight, whether he still belonged to it, or whether he'd been living too long among its ghosts. The thunder rolled again, closer this time. The first drops of rain began to fall, slow, heavy, patient, each one hissing softly as it hit the fire. None of them moved, and for a brief, fragile moment beneath that endless sky, the rancher and the Apache sister sat together, three strangers bound not by trust, but by pain, by the shared knowing that survival in the West was not about winning, it was about enduring. The storm rolled in just before dawn, slow and deliberate, like a beast that had been stalking the land all night. Thunder crawled across the sky and lightning split the horizon wide open, painting the mesa in flashes of silver and shadow. The rain came next, not a gentle drizzle, but a hard, relentless downpour that hit the ground like 1,000 tiny hoofbeats. The air was thick with the scent of wet earth and sage. Ethan stood at the porch, hat pulled low, watching the rain turn the yard into a pool of mud. The horses shifted restlessly in the corral, snorting, stamping their hooves as the wind screamed across the plains. In the distance, the mountains vanished behind a curtain of mist. The storm had swallowed everything. Inside the bunkhouse, a faint glow still burned. The sisters hadn't slept. He could see their silhouettes through the window. Two figures huddled close, whispering, planning, waiting. Ever since Mason's visit the night before, none of them had found rest. The air around the ranch had changed. It felt charged, dangerous, as if the land itself knew blood would soon be spilled. Ethan's hand rested on the cold steel of his revolver. He had cleaned it twice since midnight, even though it didn't need cleaning. It wasn't the gun he was worried about. It was the man he might have to become again, the one he'd buried with his wife, the one who'd once been quick to draw, quicker to kill. He didn't want that man back. But he could feel him stirring, restless and ready, somewhere deep beneath the surface. The first sign as the morning light broke weakly through the storm. Tyla stepped out of the bunkhouse, pulling her shawl tight around her shoulders. The rain had soaked her hair, dark strands clinging to her face. She didn't seem to notice. Her eyes were fixed on the horizon. "Something's wrong," she said quietly. Ethan followed her gaze. Through the shifting veil of rain, a movement flickered along the canyon ridge, small at first, almost invisible, then clear. Riders, at least 5 of them. "He's back," Ethan muttered. Taylor's jaw tightened. "And he's not alone." Naya appeared in the doorway behind her, knife at her belt, rifle in hand. Her expression was fierce, but her eyes betrayed the smallest flicker of fear, not for herself, but for what might happen here if they lost. Ethan turned to her. "Get the horses ready. If it comes to it, you ride east. The canyon splits there. You can lose them in the rocks." Naya shook her head sharply. "We don't run." "You don't win a gunfight outnumbered 5-3, he said, his voice like gravel. "You forget," Naya replied, lifting the rifle. "We've been outnumbered our whole lives." The look she gave him, bold, unflinching, reminded Ethan of the desert itself. Beautiful, untamed, merciless. The first rider appeared on the ridge. Mason. Even from that distance, Ethan recognized the broad shoulders, the dark hat, the confident way he sat his horse, like a man who believed the world owed him obedience. Behind him, 4 others followed, rifles slung across their saddles, their faces hidden by bandanas. "Tyla," Ethan said, eyes still on the ridge. "Take cover by the barn. If they come down the trail, they'll aim for the corral first." She nodded once and moved fast, silent as a shadow. Naya climbed onto the porch beside Ethan, crouched low, rain streaming from her hair. The storm roared around them, the wind carrying the faint, ghostly sound of laughter from the ridge, the kind of laughter that meant blood was coming. The standoff. The riders reached the bottom of the trail and fanned out in a half circle, their horses stamping nervously in the mud. Mason dismounted slowly, boots sinking into the wet earth. His long coat clung to him like a second skin. He smiled up at the porch, that same cruel smile that had turned Ethan's stomach the night before. "You've got a talent for picking the wrong side, McCall," he called out over the rain. "Those two ain't worth dying for." Ethan's voice carried steady through the storm. "Then why bring an army?" Mason's grin widened. "Insurance." He raised his hand and two of his men began moving toward the barn. Ethan's jaw tightened. Tala was hidden behind it somewhere waiting. She'd only get one clean shot. And if she missed, it would be over fast. "You don't want this fight," Ethan said. "Turn around and ride out," Mason spat. "Don't tell me what I want." He pointed at the bunkhouse. "They stole from me. One of them took something that's mine." "Your lies are old," Naya called out, stepping forward. Her voice cut clean through the wind. "You took our brother. You used him. You sold him." Mason's smirk faltered for just a second. Boy made his choices. "No." Tala's voice came from the shadows by the barn, low, steady, cold. "You made them for him." For a moment everything went still. No wind, no thunder, only the low creak of leather and the restless shifting of horses. Then, like lightning splitting the sky, the first shot rang out. Tala's rifle cracked through the rain. One of Mason's men dropped instantly, falling backward into the mud. Chaos exploded. The fight for Dry Creek gunfire tore through the storm. The rain turned red where it hit the ground. Ethan fired once, twice. Clean shots measured, no hesitation. His mind went quiet, his instincts sharp. The world shrank to the rhythm of gunfire and heartbeats. Naya moved beside him with a grace that was almost frightening. She fired from the hip, reloaded fast, ducked low behind the porch rail. The recoil didn't shake her. She was steady, calm, like she'd done this 100 times before. Mason's men scattered for cover, firing back through the sheets of rain. Bullets splintered the porch beams. One struck the lantern beside Ethan, shattering it into a burst of fire and glass. The barn door flew open. Tala stepped into the storm. Coat whipping behind her, rifle raised again. She hit another man clean through the chest before he could turn his gun. "Naya!" she shouted. "To the corral!" Naya broke from the porch and ran, boots splashing through the mud. Ethan covered her, firing twice more, cutting down a man who had turned his aim her way. The sound of the storm and the gunfire fused into one endless roar, a wild symphony of chaos, fear, and fury. Mason ducked behind his horse, firing blind toward the house. His voice cut through the thunder, raw with rage. "You'll die for this, McCall. All of you." "Maybe," Ethan muttered, loading another round. "But not today." Blood in the rain, the battle didn't last long, it never did. When the last shot faded into the storm, only the rain kept falling. The mud was thick with the weight of what had happened. 3 men lay still. One crawled toward the canyon, leaving a trail that washed away almost as soon as it was made. Mason was gone. Ethan scanned the ridge, heart pounding, but there was no sign of him. The trail behind the corral was churned up, hoofprints leading east fast and desperate. He had run. The silence that followed was suffocating. Tala leaned against the barn wall, breathing hard. One hand pressed against a gash on her arm. Naya dropped to her knees beside the fallen horse, her chest heaving, rain and tears mingling on her face. Ethan walked slowly toward her, mud clinging to his boots. The storm had already begun to fade, thunder rolling farther away like a memory losing its echo. He knelt beside her. "You all right?" She nodded once, though her lips trembled. "He's running to where our brother is," she whispered. "He'll reach the camp before we do." Ethan looked out toward the canyon where the trail disappeared into the mist. "Then we'd better ride at first light." Naya met his eyes, and for the first time since he'd met her, the fire in them softened. "You'd come with us?" He looked toward the land that had been his prison for 2 long, lonely years. The ranch, the graves, the emptiness. And for the first time since he buried his wife, he didn't feel bound to it anymore. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I'll come." The wind eased. The storm passed. But the west, cruel, restless, eternal, waited beyond the horizon, knowing the real fight was still ahead. The storm had left the land washed clean, but not renewed. It was the kind of storm that scoured rather than healed, tearing branches from the cottonwoods, flooding the dry creek bed, and leaving behind a silence so deep it felt unnatural. The sky hung low and gray, heavy with the weight of what had been lost and what still lingered. Ethan stood by the corral as the first pale light of dawn crept over the valley. His hands were raw from the night before, his knuckles scraped, his shirt torn at the shoulder. The smell of wet earth clung to everything, the air, the horses, the mud-streaked boards of the porch. Behind him, Naya moved through the yard with restless energy, tightening saddle straps, checking rifles, preparing for the ride ahead. Her braid was damp, stray strands clinging to her face, but her eyes burned bright, fierce, focused, determined. She hadn't slept, and yet she looked more alive than ever, as if purpose itself were keeping her on her feet. Tala was quieter. She sat on the steps, wrapping a strip of torn cloth around her wounded arm, her movements slow and deliberate. The rain had washed the blood away, but not the pain. She didn't complain. She didn't need to. Her silence spoke the language of endurance, the kind known only to those who had lost too much to fear losing again. Ethan walked over, tightening his saddle cinch. "You shouldn't ride yet," he said to Tala, his voice low, careful. She looked up, her expression calm. "We ride together," she said simply. Naya glanced at him as if daring him to argue. He didn't. He knew it wouldn't matter. He could tell from their eyes. Both of them had already made peace with the cost of what lay ahead. The West wasn't a place that let people turn back. Once you started down a trail like this, there was only one way to finish it. The road to Prescott. They rode out just after sunrise, following the muddy trail east toward the canyon. The land stretched out before them, endless and empty, painted in muted tones of gold and gray. The rain had filled the gullies with thin rivers that glistened under the morning light. Birds circled high above, their cries echoing across the open sky. Ethan rode ahead, the sisters close behind. The air was sharp with the scent of mesquite and sage. Every hoofbeat seemed to carry the memory of the night before. The gunfire, the rain, the cries of dying men. The kind of sounds that stayed lodged in a man's bones. For a long while, no one spoke. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was sacred, heavy with unspoken truths. They were three people tied together now by something deeper than choice. When they finally stopped to rest by a shallow creek, Naya knelt to wash her hands in the cold water. Her reflection wavered on the surface. Fierce eyes, a face marked by dust and grief. Ethan crouched beside her horse, refilling the canteen. After a while, she said quietly, "You could have stayed behind." He looked up at her. "And let you face him alone?" "We've faced worse," she said. "Maybe," he replied, fastening the canteen lid. "But no one should have to face worse forever." She didn't answer. Instead, she looked away toward the horizon, where the trail narrowed into a winding line that cut through the red rock. The wind carried the sound of thunder again, not from the sky, but from somewhere far off deeper in the canyon. Hooves, faint but steady. Signs of pursuit then rose, eyes scanning the ridge. "They're following." Tala joined them, her face tightening. "Mason?" "Maybe," Ethan said. "Or one of his men." The three of them moved quickly, saddles tightened, rifles checked. They mounted and urged their horses into a faster pace, mud flying beneath their hooves. The canyon walls closed in around them, towering high and narrow, streaked with veins of red and gold stone. The sound of the pursuing riders grew louder, not close enough to see, but close enough to know they were being hunted. They rode for hours through the canyon's winding paths, their shadows long and thin across the rock. When they finally emerged onto the open mesa, the sun was already sinking low. Exhaustion hung over them like a fog, but none spoke of stopping. "We're close," Tala said, pointing toward the distant ridge. "There, the smoke, that's the camp." Ethan followed her gaze. A thin column of smoke rose from behind a cluster of boulders on the far side of the valley. It was faint, almost hidden. The kind of smoke made by a small fire, the kind meant to go unnoticed. They dismounted behind a low ridge and led the horses to cover. From there, they could see the camp clearly. 3 tents, 2 wagons, a few horses tied near a fire pit. And near the far wagon, movement. A man chained to the wheel. "Coda," Tala whispered. Naya's breath caught. Her fingers trembled slightly as she reached for the rifle slung across her back. "We go now," she said. Ethan placed a hand on her arm. "Not yet. We need a plan. No time," she snapped. They could move him again. "And if we rush in blind," he said quietly, "we die before we reach him." Naya turned to him, eyes blazing. "You don't understand." "I do," Ethan cut in, his voice steady but full of something raw, something that stopped her mid-breath. "I buried the only person I ever loved because I thought time was against me. I won't bury you too." The wind swept between them, stirring the dust. Naya stared at him, her jaw tight, her anger faltering into something else, a mix of defiance and pain. Tala stepped forward. "He's right," she said gently. We wait until nightfall. Naya looked between them, then turned away, kneeling by the ridge. She pressed her forehead briefly to the barrel of her rifle. A silent prayer. A vow. Nightfall. The sun slipped below the horizon, and darkness fell like a curtain. The air cooled, the desert turning silver under the rising moon. Crickets sang from the grass, their song blending with the crackle of the campfire below. Ethan crouched low beside the sisters, eyes fixed on the camp. 2 guards sat near the fire, talking in low voices. Another dozed near the wagon. Coda was still chained, his head bowed, his long hair falling over his face. "Tala," Ethan whispered. "You take the one by the wagon. I'll handle the guards by the fire. Naya, you get to your brother." Naya nodded once. Her hands were steady now. Her eyes, sharp as a hawk's, caught the moonlight. They moved like ghosts. The desert swallowed their sound. The soft crunch of boots in the sand, the whisper of wind through dry grass. Ethan crept closer, his revolver drawn. The firelight painted the ground in flickering gold. One guard shifted, muttering something under his breath. Ethan waited, one heartbeat too, then lunged forward, his hand clamping over the man's mouth as the gun came down hard. The second guard barely had time to turn before Tala's knife flashed in the dark. Naya reached the wagon. Her knees hit the dirt beside her brother. "Coda," she whispered. The man stirred weakly, his voice hoarse. "Naya, it's me," she breathed. "We're here. We're taking you home." His wrists were torn raw from the chains. She worked the lock with trembling hands until it snapped open. He fell into her arms, body frail but alive. Tears streaked her dust-covered face. Behind them, Ethan stood over the fallen guards, chest heaving. "We need to move," he said. "Now." But before they could reach the horses, a gunshot tore through the night. The echo rolled across the canyon. A voice followed. Cold. Venomous, familiar. "You didn't think I'd let you walk away? Did you?" Mason stepped from the shadows, rifle in hand, moonlight glinting off the steel. And this time, he wasn't alone. The night air turned sharp and thin, the kind of cold that cut straight through a man's chest. The moon hung low, casting a pale light across the canyon floor. Smoke from the campfire drifted in ragged ribbons, blurring the line between shadow and flame. Ethan could taste the dust, feel the tremor of the earth under his boots as horses shifted somewhere in the dark. The silence that followed the gunshot was unbearable. It wasn't peace. It was the pause before the world fell apart. Mason stood at the edge of the firelight, rifle leveled, eyes glinting like shards of glass. Rain had darkened his coat to near black, and his smile, that slow, mean smile, was back. Behind him, 3 armed men fanned out across the ridge, their silhouettes haloed by the flicker of the dying flames. "You should have kept to your ranch, McCall," Mason drawled. "Wasn't your business." Ethan didn't flinch. He stepped forward, his revolver low but ready. "You made it my business when you brought your war to my land." "War?" Mason laughed. "No, rancher. This is justice. Those savages took from me." Naya's voice cut through his laughter, fierce, trembling with rage. "We took nothing. You took our brother's life and sold it for silver." Mason turned toward her, his expression twisting with something ugly. "He's worth less than the horse he rode in on." Before the words had fully left his mouth, Naya fired. The shot echoed like thunder. Mason staggered, his shoulder jerking back as the bullet tore through him. He didn't fall. He just grinned wider, the kind of grin that made the blood run cold, and raised his rifle. Ethan moved faster than thought. His revolver barked once, twice. 2 of Mason's men dropped where they stood, the third bolting for cover. The world became chaos. Gunfire cracking through the night, dust rising in choking clouds, the flash of muzzle light illuminating faces twisted in fury and fear. Naya dropped to the ground beside Coda, shielding him with her body as bullets tore into the wagon behind them. Tala fired from the shadows, her aim unerring even with her wounded arm. Every shot she took was deliberate, measured, deadly. Ethan ducked behind a crate, reloading with shaking hands. He could feel his pulse hammering in his throat. The air smelled of smoke and blood. Then, silence again. The kind of silence that hums alive with what's about to happen next. The reckoning when the gunfire ceased. Only 2 figures remained standing in the open. Ethan and Mason. The moonlight washed over them both, silvering the mud and the dead. They faced each other across the fire pit, the dying flames painting their faces with ghostly orange light. Ethan's revolver hung heavy in his grip. Mason's rifle dangled uselessly at his side, his hand slick with blood from the wound in his shoulder. "Always figured you for a coward," Ethan said quietly. Mason spat into the dirt. "You think you're better than me, rancher? You think you're a hero for siding with them?" He sneered toward the sisters. "They'll turn on you too. They all do." Ethan stepped closer, boots sinking into the wet ground. "Maybe they will, but at least they've got honor." "Honor?" Mason barked out a bitter laugh. "There's no honor left in this land, McCall. Just men too stubborn to die." The rifle came up again, slow, shaky. But the moment Mason's finger twitched on the trigger, Ethan fired. The sound was deafening in the still night. Mason stumbled backward, the rifle falling from his hands. For a second he looked surprised, almost confused, as if he couldn't believe it was finally over. Then he crumpled into the mud, his eyes open, staring blankly at the sky. The silence that followed was complete. No wind, no sound, just the faint crackle of dying embers and the distant cry of a night bird. Ethan lowered his revolver, his breath ragged. His hands trembled. Naya rose slowly, still holding Coda, her face pale in the moonlight. Tala approached from the other side, her steps careful, her wound reopened and bleeding again through the cloth. None of them spoke. There was nothing left to say. The West had spoken for them. Through thunder, through blood, through the quiet that followed death. The morning after, when dawn finally came, it painted the desert in gold and rose. The storm clouds had drifted away during the night, leaving behind a sky so wide and clear it felt like forgiveness. The air was cool, fresh with the scent of sage after rain. Birds wheeled high above, calling to each other as the first light spilled over the canyon. Ethan stood on the ridge overlooking the valley. His coat was torn, his hands bruised, but his eyes were calm. For the first time in years, he felt the world breathing again, not against him, but with him. Behind him, the sisters tended to Coda. He was weak but alive, his face lined with pain but softened by relief. Tala worked quietly, cleaning his wounds with water from the creek. Naya sat beside him, her head resting against his shoulder. It was the first time Ethan had seen her still. No fire, no fury, just quiet, aching love. When she finally looked up at him, her eyes met his across the light. "It's over," she said softly. Ethan nodded. "For now," she smiled faintly. "Nothing's ever over out here, is it?" He almost smiled back. "No, the West doesn't end. It just waits for the next fight." They both turned their eyes toward the horizon. Endless, shimmering, merciless. Tala walked to him, her shawl pulled tight, her movements slow but steady. She stopped beside him, following his gaze toward the rising sun. "You've lost much," she said quietly, "but you stayed when others would have left." "Maybe I didn't know how to leave," Ethan murmured. "Then learn now," Tala said. "Go where the wind doesn't hurt so much." He turned to her, and for the first time since his wife's death he smiled, not out of joy but out of understanding. Naya approached, helping Coda to his feet. The young man, pale but standing, looked at Ethan with quiet gratitude. "You saved us," he said. Ethan shook his head. "No, you saved yourselves. I just helped aim." Naya's smile flickered through tears. "Then ride with us," she said. "See the world beyond Dry Creek." He looked toward his ranch in the distance, a lonely house framed against the morning sun, smoke curling gently from the chimney. For years it had been his prison. Now it looked small. "Maybe," he said, "but not yet." He walked to his horse, tightening the reins, eyes fixed on the horizon. "The land's not done with me." The sisters watched as he mounted and turned toward the west. The sun climbed higher, spreading gold across the valley, washing the scars of the night in light. Ethan McCall didn't look back. He didn't need to. The rancher rode slow into the morning, leaving behind the ghosts of Dry Creek and the echoes of gunfire. The sisters stood together, their hands clasped, the wind carrying the faintest whisper of peace. And for the first time in a long time, the West, cruel, boundless, beautiful, felt like it had forgiven them all. The wind had changed again. It no longer carried the wild rage of the storm, nor the gunpowder stench of battle. It was quieter now, older, gentler, as though the land itself had grown weary of violence. The sun hung low over the mesa, spilling light across the canyon where the fires of the night before had finally gone out. The West was breathing again, but it didn't forgive easily. Ethan rode alone along the ridge, his horse's hooves stirring soft trails of dust in the morning air. Behind him, the tracks of the Apache sisters and their brother wound toward the far side of the desert, where the hills met the distant horizon. They had left at first light. 3 figures bound by blood, riding for a home that might no longer exist, but that still lived in their hearts. He could still hear Naya's voice when they said goodbye. It had been quiet, almost tender, stripped of the sharp edges she usually wore like armor. "You've got a place with us if you want it," she had said. He had only nodded. Words weren't enough to answer something like that. Because what she was really offering wasn't a place. It was peace. And peace, Ethan McCall knew, was something a man had to earn. The ghosts of Dry Creek. By the time he reached the ranch, the sun was high and the heat shimmered like glass over the dry earth. The windmill creaked lazily, turning slow circles over a world that seemed smaller now. The yard was littered with reminders of the fight, shell casings glinting in the dirt. A broken fence post, blood darkened to rust in the mud. The smell of smoke still hung faintly in the air. Ethan dismounted, his boots hitting the ground with a soft thud. Every step toward the house felt like walking through the pages of a memory. The porch boards groaned under his weight, the same way they had the night he'd pretended to sleep. He could almost see her again, his wife Sarah, standing in the doorway, her smile framed by the fading light of a summer evening. "You're quiet again, Ethan," she had once said. "You only get that way when something's eating at your heart." And God, how his heart had been eaten hollow since. He sat on the steps and looked out across the land. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. The valley still stretched wide and merciless, but he no longer felt like it was watching him. It just was, wild, eternal, indifferent. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and whispered, "I did what I could, Sarah. I did what I thought was right." The words hung there, carried away by the wind, and for the first time, they didn't come back to haunt him. The sisters' journey miles away. Across the sandstone flats, the Apache sisters rode beside their brother, Tala led, her posture straight despite the exhaustion that threatened to pull her down. Naya rode behind her, keeping pace with Koda's slow, unsteady rhythm. Every so often she glanced over at him, half in relief, half in disbelief. He was alive. Thin, bruised, broken in body but not in spirit. His eyes still burned with the quiet fire of a man who had endured and refused to yield. "Rest soon," Naya said softly. "There's water ahead." He smiled faintly, his voice barely more than a whisper. "You haven't changed." She shook her head. "No one does out here. The desert keeps us the way it found us." Tala slowed her horse, turning toward them. "Not true," she said. "It burns us, reshapes us, leaves only what's strong enough to stay." Naya smiled at that, a small, weary smile that felt like light breaking through dust. They rode in silence after that, their shadows long across the ground. The sky deepened to the color of steel. Somewhere behind them, far beyond the ridge, they could see a faint column of smoke rising from the direction of Dry Creek. Ethan's land. Naya's voice was quiet when she finally spoke. "You think he'll be all right?" Tala looked toward the smoke. "He's a man built of sorrow and earth. Men like that don't die easy." The stranger in town. 3 days later, Ethan rode into the small town of Ash Hollow. It was little more than a cluster of weathered buildings leaning into the wind. A saloon, a church, a blacksmith's, and a general store with a porch that sagged like an old mule. The townsfolk stared as he passed. They always did. A man riding alone, dust-covered and silent, carried his own kind of story. He tied his horse outside the saloon and pushed through the swinging doors. The place smelled of whiskey, tobacco, and old secrets. A few men sat at the bar, heads bent low. A piano sat in the corner, silent and missing 2 keys. Ethan ordered a drink, not for the taste, but for the stillness it offered. As he stood there, the mirror behind the counter caught his reflection. The same broad shoulders, the same weathered face, but something was different. The hardness in his eyes had softened, replaced by something quieter. "Heard there was shooting near Dry Creek," the barkeep said, sliding him the glass. "Mason's men?" Ethan nodded once. "They won't be coming back." The barkeep studied him a moment, then nodded. "Shame about what he did. Shame about a lot of things out here." Ethan sipped the whiskey, eyes fixed on the mirror. "Yeah," he said softly. "The West's got a long memory." He left the saloon just as the sky began to blush with evening light. Down the street, a young woman stood by a wagon gathering supplies. She looked up as he passed, her expression curious, open. For a moment he thought he saw something of Naya in her. That same defiant spark, that same will to live. He tipped his hat and kept walking. Some things, he knew, were better left unspoken. Redemption beneath the desert sky as night fell. Ethan camped just beyond town, beside a dry riverbed that glowed silver under the moon. The wind whispered through the grass and the stars hung like lanterns over the endless black. He sat by his small fire, hat in his lap, and let the quiet settle deep inside him. It was a strange feeling. Peace mixed with sorrow, loss braided with something that felt almost like hope. He thought of Tala's steady voice, of Naya's fire, of Koda's broken smile. He thought of his wife's laughter. He thought of every face that the West had taken and every life it had left behind. Then, slowly he spoke aloud, to no one, to everyone, to the land itself. "You can bury a man in this country," he said, voice low, rough with emotion, "but you can't bury what he remembers." The fire cracked softly in reply. He leaned back against his saddle, eyes fixed on the stars. For the first time in years he didn't feel alone, and as he drifted into sleep, the wind carried the faint sound of distant hoofbeats, not real, not near, but somewhere in the memory of the land. The Apache sisters riding east, their laughter fading into the night. The wind had shifted again. It no longer carried the sharp sting of gunfire, or the scent of blood baked into the earth. Now it was softer, dry, cool, and restless, moving like an old spirit across the plains. It whistled through the canyons, rattled the dead branches, and brushed gently across the wooden cross that stood alone on the ridge overlooking Dry Creek. Beneath that cross lay what was left of the past, the bones of struggle, the echoes of gunshots, the ghosts of the people who had come here and bled into the soil. But in the morning light, when the sun poured gold over the valley, the place didn't look like death anymore. It looked like forgiveness. Ethan McCall stood beside that cross, hat in hand, eyes distant. He had returned after weeks on the trail. The sisters were long gone now, far to the east, where the land was greener and the air smelled of pine instead of dust. He didn't know if he'd ever see them again, but their memory lived here, stitched into the land the way scars stitched into skin. The ranch was quiet again, almost too quiet. The fences had been repaired, the barn stood steady, and the herd, smaller now, grazed lazily under the rising sun. It could have been any morning in the West, but for Ethan, every sunrise now carried the weight of what had been done and what it had cost. A visit from the past. That afternoon, a rider appeared on the road leading into the valley. Ethan saw her long before she reached the gate, a lone figure, hair dark as the storm clouds that once broke over this land, her posture proud, her movements deliberate. Naya, he wasn't surprised. Somehow he had always known she'd come back. She dismounted without a word, her boots crunching softly on the gravel. The wind tugged at her coat and the sun caught in her eyes. That same sharp, defiant fire he'd seen the first night they met, but tempered now with something gentler. "You found us again," Ethan said, his voice low, calm. "We weren't lost," she replied. "Just gone for a while." For a long moment neither spoke. The silence between them was deep, full of all the words they didn't need to say. The West had taught them both that some truths only lived in silence. Finally, she reached into her saddlebag and pulled out something small, a necklace of bone and turquoise, its thread worn and faded. She placed it gently in his hand. "Tala wanted you to have it," she said, "for what you gave." Ethan studied the necklace, the smooth edges of the bone catching the light. It was simple, handmade, but it carried weight. A symbol, a promise. "How is she?" he asked. "Strong," Naya said. "Always strong, Koda too. He walks again. He's quieter than before, but his spirit's still there." She paused, her gaze falling on the horizon. "We're heading north soon. Maybe we'll find a place where we can stop running." "Maybe," Ethan said softly. "But the West doesn't let go easy." She smiled faintly. "No, it doesn't. But it remembers." Stories that linger that night as the sun dipped behind the mesa. The two of them sat on the porch, side by side, watching the world darken. The sky blazed in shades of red and violet, the kind of sunset that made the land look alive, as if it were breathing. Naya spoke first, her voice quiet, carried by the wind. "When we were little," she said, "our father used to tell stories by the fire. He'd say that the spirits of the land watched everything, the rivers, the storms, the people. That the wind carried their memories, and if you listened closely enough, you could still hear them. Ethan nodded. He was right. She looked at him then, her eyes glistening in the fading light. I can hear them now. I hear my father. I hear the men who died for greed. I hear the women who never got to speak their truth. They're all in the wind. Ethan's gaze followed hers toward the distant hills. And what do they say? Naya smiled, not wide but real. They say keep going. The quiet stretched between them again, and for the first time since he buried his wife, Ethan felt something like peace. Not joy, not redemption, but peace. The fragile kind that comes when a man stops running from his ghosts. The man who stayed Naya left the next morning. She didn't say goodbye. She didn't need to. The sound of her horse's hooves faded into the distance until it was swallowed by the wind. Ethan watched until she disappeared behind the ridge, then turned back to the ranch. The land was his again, not as a burden, but as a companion. The silence no longer weighed on him. It filled him instead, like the slow rhythm of a heartbeat. He fixed the roof, mended the fences, planted new crops where the ground had gone barren, and at night, when the coyotes howled from the hills, he sat on the porch with a lantern and listened. Sometimes, if the wind blew just right, he thought he could hear voices carried across the plains. Laughter, whispers, maybe even her name. Word spread, as it always did in the West. They said a rancher in Dry Creek had faced down a gang and lived. They said he rode with Apache warriors and protected their kin. They said he'd loved and lost and learned the quiet strength of mercy. And though no one could prove the story true, travelers still came through Dry Creek now and then, asking about the rancher who lived alone on the edge of the desert. The one who didn't speak much but carried the weight of a legend in his eyes. The legend endures years past. The West changed. Railroads came. Towns grew. The dust of the old trails began to settle. But when the sun set low and the wind swept across the plains, the old stories came alive again. They said that sometimes when the light hit just right, you could still see a figure standing by the cottonwood tree on the ridge, tall, still, a hat brim pulled low watching the horizon. And if you listened close enough, you might hear faint laughter carried on the wind. Two sisters and their brother riding east, free at last. The land remembered. It always did, and so did he.